Aloha, family. This is the Revolution podcast. It's been a hot minute, and I'm excited to do a little comeback episode with my esteemed brethren and colleagues, co-authors of the book Sex, Masculinity, God, welcoming Daniel Dick and Cattle Lass. Gentlemen, it's been a long time coming.
Happy to be here, Kevin.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Feels good to be here. And yeah, this episode, we are going to do a little recap, round robin, and trialogue. We're going to invoke the Trilogos today, as we have many times before, all around our appearance and our kind of TEDx talk and presentation at the European Men's Gathering, which was in Denmark about a month ago. Where we presented our book and underwent a series of initiations and intense ritual processes designed to facilitate the death of the patriarchs and invite and instill that process internally and externally in over 100 men in Europe. So if you're not familiar with Manifesto and the work of Paul Lloyd Robson, and the co-founders there, also with Alexander Bard and Thomas Hammerlich. This is an amazing group of men in Europe doing men's work and really on the cutting edge of sense making and speaking into both the crisis of masculinity and the gender wars and the culture wars, toxic masculinity, Me Too movement, all of that, and the reinvigoration of positive masculinity, which is men initiated into service, becoming better lovers, better leaders in business, better warriors in their community, and really doing that deep work that we all know is possible. I've been blessed to be a part of. I know you men have been blessed to be a part of. I know Cadell's led a men's circle. Daniel's done a lot of this work with masculinity. So I just want to start the round robin off by kicking it to you, Cadell, and like just giving some context and some of your initial statements around the event. And I'm sure we'll get into some storytelling here because it was intense.
Sure. Yeah. The manifesto is a group operating in Europe, as you say. Specifically, the event was in Denmark, and I invite anyone who hasn't yet heard of them to just check out Manifesto, and you Google it, and it'll be the first thing that comes up, or should be the first thing that comes up. And the Manifesto event was something that I was really looking forward to because it was really the first time that I would be to a full-blown conference or a full-blown, I guess the best word is event that focuses specifically on men's issues, not necessarily men's rights, but just sort of more the deeper spiritual questions of what it means to be a man. And that in some sense for me in my year was a culmination of really the importance of brotherhood. Like, as you said, I played my part in leading a men's circle, both physical and virtual, throughout the coronavirus, really. And I've come to find that the brotherhood in such environments has been a necessary therapeutic outlet for me. I think it was something that really I was missing in my 20s. I think that looking back and reflecting on my life as a whole, I think in my teenage years and certainly growing up, brotherhood, literally brotherhood with my brother, and then brotherhood with my friends growing up, in my teenage years, was maybe I don't want to understate how fundamental it was to my development. I think that it was essential. Looking back on it, I couldn't imagine being the man I am today without sort of having a strong network of other men that, although of course not sexual relationships, are in many ways intimate relationships. And I missed that a lot in my 20s. And I think since coronavirus, taking steps to rebuild brotherhood has become an essential aspect of my adult identity. And I think that this Manifesto event was just a culmination of that. And it just demonstrated to me concretely how worthwhile this effort is. Before passing it on to Daniel, I would just say that the event was nothing like an academic conference. My background, for those of you who follow me or those of you who know my work, I come from academia. I've been to many conferences, but this event really stands out to me. And it really marks I think, an important transition in my intellectual development, because it showed me really what embodied cognition was all about. And it showed me what being an intellectual meant could also be deeply embodied. And that actually has awakened many positive spirits in me. Mostly because before I was an academic, I was first and foremost an athlete. And I love athletics and I love sports. And actually, I find brotherhood in sports. And in some sense, when I stopped my dream of becoming a professional athlete, I became an academic. And in the same process, I lost brotherhood. That's not to say that brotherhood isn't possible in academia, but it's certainly of a different nature. So with that being said, I just really think that this is just really a great example of responsible masculinity. I think that the ripple effects of such work and the ripple effects of such events necessarily can affect society in a very positive way. And I hope that that will sort of be evident and seen in sort of the aftermath of what I do with my life in the coming years. So I'll pass that to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Kirill. To give us some context, I mean, for me, this event, it's hardly to describe it as an event or gathering and say something more precise about it, because if you just come to say something more precise, you already have to go into the details, because it had so many facets, so many different layers. And I want to really emphasize this part, because that was really outstanding for me. I've never experienced such an event that has this multiplicity of involving you mentally, physically, emotionally, on all different levels. And that's why it's very different to say it wasn't a conference, it wasn't a ritual, it wasn't, I mean, there were 105 men coming together, experiencing academic content, experiencing archaic rituals, experiencing raw emotions, and experiencing embodying sports, wrestling, and all these kind of different stuff, even going deep into mythological embodiment itself, but also into mythological storytelling. Just to sketch a bit on what we're talking about, this variety of things in just only 3 days. I mean, the second day we have been there when we were talking about how long are we here? Was it a week already? It was so dense, so not only intense, but also dense on the density of different layers that you have been kind of stimulated to enact, so you're part in it. And the other part that I found very beautifully is that, and very outstanding from what I have experienced before, are mainly two parts. On one hand, what we experience there is completely shared leadership, like so much collaborative work. There is not only one person. I mean, Paul is doing a lot of responsibility, but he gives up a lot of responsibility. Nobody knew the full schedule, like the full content itself. Nobody, because everybody contributed a part. This is something is very new, and is, I think, very crucial to a kind of new masculinity, that there's not only one guy, but a collaborative coming together of leadership. And the third part is, or the second part or the third part that has been very outstanding for me, was actually that you have the content itself, the reason to come together, because we were talking about masculinity, and it's not about getting into a brutal, violent, old patterns of societies of man that like to drink or get into sports or come together in secrecy and exercise power over each other and so on. But having this coming together to really evolve as a fresh identity is relying on old things, but getting things into contemporary issues, which makes or fills the gap of a new space where you're not bashing anymore and shaming masculinity, but looking into it as something positive and also foster and engage into this positive masculine aspect. And how this has been done by Dieter, we can come by the next round. But to have this gathering as something that has filled a gap, which I see broadly in Western societies, where there is a way to come together as a man for masculinity, and it is a fresh one. It has a new touch, but is relying on old and very old rituals and forms and things to do. So it is a beautiful coming together of really old things that really worked out, but also putting it into a new contemporary way to exercise them collaboratively.
Yeah, I
Really.
love that you're bringing that part out, because to my mind, and this is kind of one of the meta issues in the society, because all of society is composed of men and women, and half of the world is male. I think slightly more is female, according to the latest censuses. But there's a massive loss of the rites of passage. And we've discussed this in our book project. We discussed this pretty much endlessly as kind of one of the core orbiting issues in the constellation of issues that make up the meta crisis. To me, a huge part of the meta crisis being the lack of strong men, strong male leaders, husbands, fathers, in leadership, raising children, male mentors. This is also a crisis. And I would define strong in this context as a man who has undergone a rite of passage or an initiation ritual, which is something we find in all cultures at all times. And events like this are recreations of that. And to your point, Daniel, we're infusing ancient rituals that actually facilitate the transformation of a male adolescent ego into an adult male ego and role. And there's a spiritual dimension of this that's quite deep. There's an emotional dimension of this that's quite intense. And thank God for Paul and the brothers in Europe and Manifesto for lighting that torch, and I've been blessed to have been part of multiple different men's movements here in the United States. And this was for me, it was a completely different rendition, and it was much more theatrical. It was much more pagan. It was more ancient in some ways. It was more intense in the emotional, edgy layer of kind of the Scandinavian brothers that were there. I mean, there were men from all over Europe and the US, primarily Scandinavian men, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, Finnish, which was a really interesting culture shock for me to experience men's work in that context. It was very Viking and intense. Where an interesting meta theme is in the Western, as in the United States, men's work I've been a part of, there's more of a shamanic overtone. So a lot of the work is informed by the plant medicine traditions of Mexico, Central and South America. And that kind of shows up. There's also the inheritance, which I loved, that was spoken to, of Robert Bly and Iron John and the mythopoetic men's movement, which was 70s, 80s on, which a lot of people will be familiar with, Mankind Project being probably the most famous organization. And there's some of that more traditional, archetypal, very circling men's process type work that we always did. We also did very neo-tantric, deep emotional cathartic practices. We also literally enacted a ritual a ritual killing of these patriarch figures that represented both the old style of masculinity, the patriarchy, and it represented, you know, dethroning the tyrant or the dark masculine aspect of the father within our own psyche. And so the keynote speaker, one of the main speakers was Jonathan Pageau, which was an incredible plot point for that weekend we spent together, because it was all about covering the father. Yes, you want to kill your father in the Freudian sense, all the way down to like the infantile urges, all the way up to the meta sense of, okay, we don't want, you know, maybe the Bidens or the, you know, just name any of Trudeau's, the tyrants in power right now and how they've handled the coronavirus crisis. And at the same time, you have to give them gratitude and make that offering of thank you for building something that we can build upon. And so that's that polarity of opposites that we experienced quite viscerally at the event. I'll kick it to you, Kidal, to respond to that.
Yeah, well, I just would say like it was a ritual liminal space, and I think that to become a man, in some sense, you do need a rite of passage. Maybe that is the central concept here we're circling around. And for, I think, ancient societies, that rite of passage for women was often the process of giving birth, becoming a mother. Perhaps that art and that rite of passage for women also needs some attention today, although it's certainly more of a natural embodied given in some sense, although this is also kind of getting shakier, I sense. But when it comes to men, of course, in traditional cultures, rites of passage were often socially mediated by elders and socially mediated by a certain cultural framework that was sort of embedded and tested. You know, a man would, you know, there would be a certain maturation process that would be ignited by a rite of passage. I think that in some sense, looking at my own life, almost unconsciously ignited my own sort of rite of passage in the way I approached academics. I almost feel like the way I initiated that journey was a kind of rite of passage, and I kind of went through a psychological transformation in that rite of passage that led me to a direct confrontation with the father complex in my own head. As I talked about in the talk we gave at the EMG. And basically, you know, to be clear to like the people who are listening now, is that basically that rite of passage is basically some sort of discontinuity or event in a man's life, which somehow clearly separates a before and an after as it relates to childhood and adulthood. And like I said, I think I unconsciously almost initiated that process in myself through academics. But at the same time, I think that there is a need for society to once again set up cultural structures that help men sort of consciously confront that rite of passage. And I think that that's in some sense what the European men's movement is trying to do with this Death of the Patriarchs event, which we attended, was basically to, in a very embodied sense and an emotional sense, help men confront that father complex in their mind. Perhaps it is worth noting that the title of this sort of event we attended was Death of the Patriarchs. And it did really sort of drive home this inner psychical conflict in each man as it relates to the idea of the perfect father, the image of the perfect father in relationship to the actual father, who is by necessity imperfect, and the psychological turmoil and the psychological struggle that's involved in that perfect image in oneself dying, realizing that it's being projected on the external. And I guess second, reconciling oneself with the actuality of imperfection. and the necessity of patriarchal leadership in that reality of imperfection, knowing that taking leadership and becoming a man and becoming a leader will necessarily involve making mistakes, will necessarily involve struggle, which will necessarily involve some sort of fight, potentially, whether abstract or concrete, that has the potential for disappointment and failure, and you could become the bad guy, and you could become the evil guy, and you could become the guy that is the source of projections of the failed perfect man. And that comes with being an adult, I suppose, and taking on that responsibility, and nonetheless being willing to take that responsibility. So I suppose that's my reflection on what that meaning of the rite of passage is as it relates to being a man today.
Yeah, to add some points on that, a ritual is always structured that it has a phase before, it has a liminal space, and then it has a phase after. So it really just, it marks a big change in and that way that it has been marked. I mean, we really don't have so many rituals that mark this change of phase of being a boy to being a man, or to become a patriarch for oneself. And the way that they did that was very, very good. I mean, on one hand, we also have in the ritual itself always like the threefold structure. You separate yourself, then you're in this liminal space of nowhere, everywhere, could be, not be, is everything, and then you just integrate it slowly into the next phase. And when it comes about the death of the patriarch, I mean, there has been so many layers onto the death of the tyrant into this event, and it has been very, I mean, when the tyrant becomes a tyrant because he just holds on to power where he is not in charge anymore. So what happens is that he's killed violently because he has to go at some point. But there is also the other way that has been as expressed by Peugeot, is that the patriarch knows when to go. And this was the beautiful paradise also enacted in this event, that actually the people that initiated as elders this event said, we need now the death of the patriarchs and you're going to kill us. It's time to go now. You take the reins, you know? So it had this very two beautiful layers. On one hand, for the people that had also in themselves projections of tyrants that has been either the father or some male other figure stopping themselves to get into the full power, but also giving the space to look into the father as something, okay, thank you for everything that you have brought to me. Now I take up the reins, you know, and I see your failures. That's why I can take up your reins, you know, and go up from there. And then that was very beautiful to see that these two ways were enacted in the event, but on very multifaceted layers. I have to get more plug-in. I give it to you.
Yeah, I love this around, well, I know, Cadell, and your studies of Freud, you know, there's this inner complex that forms between the boy and his father, which is extremely powerful. Even if your father was a good mentor and was fully present, emotionally available, this complex still forms between the perfection of what the boy imagines he needs versus what the father provides, and the competition for the feminine, the goddess, the mythical aspect of the feminine, the mother's love, right? And there's, you know, a lot of that captured in the the Oedipal story, which we did a theater to sum up the weekend at the closing ceremony. Each core group of men did a little theater production, and there was some hilarious and debaucherous Oedipal reenactments that we won't go into here, but you can imagine what that looked like. If you're not familiar with Oedipus Rex, classical Greek myth and play, highly recommend it, especially for the men out there. Yeah, the ritual space, a lot of the stuff I've read on ritual space has been through Robert Moore. His book, The Archetype of Initiation, is just a clinic on this. And also the French scholar Michel Lade. He writes deeply about liminal space, how it's created, and why it's necessary for cultures. And so think about the liminoid spaces that the cultures offer. So liminoid meaning they're not quite liminal, but they resemble it in some imagistic and substantial ways. Going to the movie theater is a ritual. There's a before, you enter the liminal space of the metaphysical or narrative structure of the movie, and you exit. This is something people experience a lot. Going to a sports game. These are micro rituals that kind of the entertainment industry and the culture offers. Then you might have something like a vacation or traveling, which can be a massive experience of liminal space that I think a lot of people will have. I think the most festivals, exactly. Festivals are a great example. And these are amazing for the society and the culture, and we need specific rituals for specific purposes. And so to your point, Cadell, yes, motherhood and really her first bleed, the menstrual cycle of the woman, is a kind of nature rite of passage for the female body and the feminine. And we probably need women's work around, how to do a healthy birth, how to support a mother. We probably even need it for young girls when they start to bleed and they start to understand their beautiful cycle of nature. There's probably events and, ritual leadership and elders that are needed for that, for the women. For men, I really see this, and I said this in the book, I believe, like Esther Perel, one of the preeminent kind of thinkers on relationships, she's like, the 20th century was all about women's liberation and empowerment, and the 21st will be about men's, which a lot of people, I think, especially on the left or the woke here in the States, there's this whole culture war thing happening. You might have heard of it. There's this debate around, are men and women equal in all ways? And this is one of the places I would disagree, based on the difference in rituals needed for a man to mature in a healthy psychological way versus a woman. Now, at this event, what I really was finding was they did a really good job. As you said, Daniel, the leadership was decentralized. This is a hot term in blockchain right now, but it's actually a tribal system. And this harkens to Dunbar's number and how human tribal dynamics and energetics form naturally and they emerge. The leadership for this was decentralized. So they had a narrative structure for the event. The patriarchs have been in power too long. The young bucks, the men being initiated, are going to seize power. And nobody really knew which ritual or which theatrical. It was very much like augmented reality. It was so immersive, as ritual is. No one really knew what was doing what. So there wasn't a central leader, which is amazing.
And it's so very important to add, no one of the participants knew anything that they were expected.
Right.
I mean, that there was no information about any program at all.
Right. Which is much different than going to a concert or a conference where it's like 8 o'clock, we do this, 10:30, we do this. We were all put into a mysterious place of unknowing. And then the ritual began. And the first day, which was, easily my favorite. Our talk was amazing, but the first day was a extremely intense physical initiation, which, was very refreshing for me, having done a lot of the intellectual and kind of more breath work and Gestalt therapy type men's work. This was just like, you're separated into teams, military style, go do hard physical labor and fast all day. Lunch is gone. You're digging ditches, you're shoveling rocks, you're trimming hedges. And then it started to evolve into expressing anger and doing like the anger process, which is extremely potent. And then combat. So jujitsu, wrestling, war paint, and intense physical exercise and brotherhood bonding that we witnessed. I think this could be one of the fascinating things to expand on. I'll kick it to you, Cadell, on this. I certainly witnessed, and we were witnessing men breaking social, cultural taboos. Why are we doing this? They're not doing what we're doing, like dynamics and like inter-masculine fighting. I'm injured, I'm tired, I can't do this. You're not carrying your weight, you know. We need to go take the patriarchs on this way. And this was all happening in an emergent way. None of this was planned or staged.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of to summarize, I think what the major point is here is that throughout the ritual process, and I think throughout real initiation processes, you are going to be experiencing and confronting psychological resistance, inner psychological resistance potentially. And I think that actually the success of an initiation and the success of a ritual is the degree to which it provokes that psychological resistance within those individuals who need to be confronted by their psychological resistance. And at the same time, having the sort of safe space, so to speak, to hold the men who are moving through that psychological resistance. In this case, to be specific, the psychological resistance that comes with confronting the failed father, or the corrupt father, or the arrogant father, or even the desire to kill the father within oneself. You know, you might have a type of resistance. For example, I saw a type of resistance within some people who were going for a sort of pacifist resistance. Like, do we really need to be violent? Do we really need to throw stones? Do we really need to burn the father? Can't we just all get along? Can't we all just hug it out? Now, this type of resistance is in some sense understandable, but at the same time, it is sort of the potential repression of the conflict of mind within one's own being. And I saw some men who were going for this pacifist resistance in a very violent way. So that's how you know there's a paradox in the resistance, is that they'll say, why can't we just be a pacifist about this, all the while themselves acting out violently? So there's this, again, this self-relating paradox that comes out, and that's sort of the telltale sign, I think, that you're dealing with a psychological resistance that's an inner conflict as opposed to a real outer conflict. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that is something that's maybe not done in our modern society, because I think that we have a phobia of our own minds, especially adults. Adults are, you could say, mentally phobic, psychically phobic. We either have a tendency to reduce everything to material, biological explanations, or we could have a spiritual view, which is very utopian and happy on the other end, but we have trouble with the actual problematics of the psyche. You know, what happens when someone breaks down? What happens when someone's going through a type of psychological trauma or psychological disruption, which is actually the potential for a huge breakthrough, you know, a breakdown to breakthrough. And the ritual space, the ceremonial space, is the space which breaks you down to break through, hopefully. In this case, we have young men who are trying to become mature adults. So you can have a breakdown of certain structures, which in the right context can lead to a breakthrough. And I think that that's what I saw in many cases. What I saw in many cases were men who at the beginning of the process looked like they were having inner conflict and tension, which could have been violent, which could have even given the expression that they didn't want to be there in the first place. And then I saw those same men a few hours later happily engaged in the outcome of the entire process. and looking like they had overcome something within themselves. So, we're handling just like chemists and physicists. I like this metaphor. Just like chemists and physicists sometimes handle dangerous material, like a chemist in the laboratory, you are sometimes working with material that is combustible, could catch on fire, could cause an explosion. It's dangerous. In the same time, I think we have to realize within psychological and spiritual circles that we're dealing with combustible material. We're dealing with dangerous material. And the ritual ceremony initiation space is where you are playing with fire, literally. I mean, metaphorically, but it's a psychological fire.
Well, we were also literally playing with fire because we burned effigies of the patriarchs. So yeah,
right on. Yeah,
I love that metaphor.
Definitely. I mean, much of you said you have been on another group. Also, I have been having my resistance to that. But basically, I have my resistance to throwing stones back to a field where the other group had putting the stones out of the field. And I have been also one of the persons that when I have been pushed by one of these people that were engaged to give us instructions, and I've been physically pushed, and then I just put them also down to earth, and I'm sure not doing that, I mean, there was, well, I still don't find very much meaning into putting stones into a field back, because that's just not in my integrity. But what I found very useful about that this was my point to trigger my anger and my aggression, to step forward and to be assertive. And this first day, there was so much nonsense things to do to get this fire burning inside of you, which breaks you down and stuff like that. And this is the alchemical process of really, I mean, every alchemical process is done by heat, and when it comes to masculine heat, it is usually either suppressed, which goes into depression, or it is over exaggerated because it was oppressed, and it becomes pure aggression. And the way that it could be handled in this first day was just mind-blowing, because on one hand, it was so provocative to get into aggression, and on the other hand, we had these amazing workshops, where you could fully enact, and that was just very beautiful to me. And I heard this saying from some man around me. It was like, wow, here are other men that can deal with more aggressive power. There is a space where I can be in my full aggressive power, and it is a container where these people can hold that. You don't get this somewhere else. And this was for me a very crucial way to really understand a masculine movement which embraces a scale of aggression, that how it can be handled and put into the healthy way to see where are the limits of my power towards the power of someone else, when it comes really to the very last point of the day, where we have been just wrestling and doing jiu-jitsu and choking each other till saying, okay, I'm done, till the point where we have been screaming each other because our boundaries have been violated, and we want these people to go somewhere else and find a way to be really assertive and really rub on each other's limits with the power of aggression, and I think that this is a very crucial part that they tackled there, and that break also the ice between everybody that was there. It was just the first day, and after having battled so many men and having done so many stupid things and good things and getting into discussions and rebellion and submission and overpowering and all these stuff. You just created this strong bond with the others. So they say, well, we got through this day, and it was a fucking hard day, and this is something very crucial that I found. And yeah, I mean, the next days were much more smoother, where we got into the intellectual space, into the mythological space, where's the fatherhood, where the wounds. I mean, I also want to highlight that was a very good way to parallel all the events with the core groups. You had a group of 10 people where you would find a mythological story along these 3 days, which somehow could be attached to your own personal story or just played it out, but somehow it would have a link to your personal story, and see in your group also the reflection, how it is played out in a microcosm, as a microcosm in this core group itself. And I mean, I found it is very interesting that most of these things you could just take that and put it into society and see, wow, here we have these people that are just following the rules, these people that are not following the rules, these people that help, and these people that just the quiet ones that never talk, or these people that always stand in the middle and are the jokers or whatever. So it was a pure liminal space which enacted it as a microcosmos for the bigger reality out there. And that was an interesting investigation of society, for me at least, to see what was happening and how people were reacting to this really provoking schedule that we have been just drawn into that without any preparation of what was to expect, what was going to happen, and there were so many real raw emotions that came up there, and was like, wow, what is actually performed because of having the meeting and touching so many real emotions in oneself. I mean, we have been even joking that we should do a fully immersive ritual like that, where the people had to really break out of narratives. But yeah, that's another story maybe to tell and to elaborate. But that would be, it is very cut on the, it's a very edgy thing too.
Very edgy. It's very edgy because the emergent property of a ritual, theatrical, mythological space is quite unpredictable. And I mean, this is what I feel like the mythological piece of this event, which, by the way, was one of the huge highlights for me compared to the other men's work I've done, where the myths are kind of told around the campfire. You're not like immersed in them. It just, for me, highlights the parts of society that are starving for mythology. And so Campbell pointed out, cultures that don't dream don't have myths. Cultures that lose myths die. Civilizations die when they stop dreaming, in the dream time, whatever you want to call it, the psychical space of archetypes, of guiding visions for humanity. I mean, this is not like Disney movies. This is, what's the story we're telling with our civilization? And, the American empire is not looking so hot right now. And I see it as the death of dreams, or the death of myth, and the death of the patriarchs. So these mythological explorations in masculinity are equally as important as the physical and mental resistance and ritual rite of passage work. That being said, so you have to do the rite of passage first. So before men can start to theorize, I'm talking to myself right now, being a very heady guy, I imagine you guys could share some of that. Before I'm going into intellectual, dissertation or theory crafting around masculinity, you got to dig the ditch. You have to face your own death. You got to do the ritual. You got to express the emotion and come to terms with some of these deep processes. And then the event did a great job of that, because the first day was this super hardcore all-day physical initiation, the death of the patriarchs, the ritual killing. Then we moved into some of the apotheosis of what's next. Now what? Now you accessed your anger and your power. And this is really one of the core messages I feel like for men out there who like specifically are like, what's men's work? Is this just men crying in a circle? Like, why do I need this? Why does my wife, why does my girlfriend keep telling me to do men's work? I hear it literally all the time on social media. Well, this is why. Come to terms with your anger and aggressive, assertive power. Transmute it into service, that fight, fuck, kill energy. Use it to provide and protect your family, your woman, your children, and your community. That to my mind, that's the whole point of this. But you can't talk about it. As you said, Cadell, it's embodied cognition. It's happening in a visceral, it's happening in the real. It's a confrontation. It's not something you can think about. And so the event did a beautiful job of like, we've accessed that, did some intense anger work, did some intense combat work. We did the bonding, the ritual of gathering as a tribe and dethroning the patriarch. And then what? And to me, that actually becomes more interesting, because what Pageau showed us using a lot of biblical symbolism, which I love. Those of you that don't know Jonathan Pageau, he's been on Jordan Peterson's podcast. He's a friend of Peterson and is just a wealth of knowledge on Eastern Orthodox Christianity and iconography and mythology. Just incredible work. What's the name of his podcast again, Cadell? Or his show?
The Symbolic World.
Yeah. So check out The Symbolic World. I highly recommend it. But essentially, the cycle of this was kind of for me, the primary thesis of the event. And I'll kind of start to do my recap here. The cycle of revolution, the cycle of violent revolution, which has been romanticized and glorified, and also defined a lot of the atrocities of the 20th century, Soviet Revolution, Socialist Party in Germany, the mass revolutions that have happened in the 20th century in the third world, worldwide, the Chinese Cultural Revolution. These are groups of young men who were like, we're going to take out the father being the cultural and societal institutions and legacy. And we're going to put our own in place, right? And this cycle just never ends, because what happens as soon as the revolutionaries kill up to take out the father, they kill down. So they kill all the dissenters. This can be like a mimetic killing of like smearing them, or it can be a physical in these tyrant cultures. And this cycle just repeats, because now a new class of revolutionary young men who don't know what to do with their aggression and their angst, who are fed up with the inequality, do it again. The only option, and this is to me it's a very Christos Buddhistic middle way, is to forgive the father and cover him. And so this was exemplified in a biblical story, which we won't go into now, but essentially Noah, his sons, after the flood, he's like drunk and naked. And he's kind of like, off his ass in a shameful state. And one of his sons is like, what a disgrace. I spit on you, which is, you can understand why you would be ashamed of the father. The other sons take a cloth and cover him. So this is a symbolic gesture of, you have to cover the father in that, yes, he was inadequate. Yes, he made mistakes, maybe even horrific ones. Instead of killing him and putting his head on a pike and being like, I'm the father now, we must go back to the good parts of culture that the patriarchy has handed down, salvage what can be salvaged, and forgive what can be forgiven. And for me, that's the Herculean task we face in the men's movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. It's too easy to point out the weaknesses or point out the failures in the father. I think bringing it back to a personal level, I probably, like many other men, have every reason to construct a negative narrative about my father. On a personal level, perhaps also on a socio-cultural level. But I don't find it too productive to live in that narrative and identify with that narrative. I think, at least in my own personal life, having worked through many psychological complexes related to the father, I think the most productive thing to do is to construct the most generous possible narrative of the father, and to attempt to build on that. And I think that that's quite easy to do once you have confronted all of the or the deep-rooted psychological complexes in your own mind, related to the father, related to the mother, related to other fundamental complexes. It's quite easy to give them the benefit of the doubt and to construct a generous narrative, because you simply reconcile your fact with the fact that everyone is imperfect. We live in an imperfect world. People are, by and large, doing the best they can with the situations they're in. Everyone is operating with imperfect information, incomplete information. Many people are operating within circumstances which are so higher order that they become radically out of their own control and out of their own capacity to master what's happening. And people can make huge mistakes. And I think a lot of sons, to continue with the theme of this specific talk, a lot of sons can find themselves in a situation where they want to metaphorically kill the father, and they want to basically negate the father, and in that sense, they struggle to identify with a metaphysical masculinity, let's say. And that's a process that each man has to struggle with and fight for, let's say. It's not a given that someone becomes a man. It's not just a given. It doesn't just happen. It's something that you fight for and you work for. I think it's a labor. And I think if that labor can be socially and culturally inscribed, I think that the emergence of men who are trying to be the best men they can be, given the circumstances, given that we live in an imperfect universe, and given that everyone has incomplete information about any complex situation, is still very much needed. It's not something that's out of date. It's not something that's evolutionarily unnecessary. So I imagine that part of our embodied whole self process here with what we're doing as authors, as philosophers, as spiritualists. I'm not sure what the right term is, but I'm sure that what our meta process is the process of putting in the work necessary to become responsible men, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, I found it so, and for our society, it has been, I mean, from the Industrial Revolution on, where the father has been basically absent to the boys, it has been so crucial to have a very healthy new way of relating to the father. On the other hand, we always have an absent father because he just went out for war, because he went out for women, because he just went out because his nature is to went out, to go out. And on one hand, we find the covering of the father. So I mean, I found it so beautifully in two ways, because on one hand we cover the father in the way that on one hand we make his faults also invisible. You know, we don't uncover them and put them into, okay, you did bad and you have been a failure of life, that's why I'm like you know, and stuff like that. But the way to give, to forgive is on one hand to acknowledge his imperfection. On the other hand, you cover his fault and you kind of honor him to have him had as a father, and you don't talk badly about him. By that, you're trying to role model, or to see him as a role model. Still, if you know that he had been his fault, you know, you give him the throne of being someone looking up to. And at the same time, what you're doing in your reflection of it is that you acknowledge your own failures, but you're thriving for being the best that you can. You know, and one is acknowledgement of failure, but putting the best out there. You know, acknowledging inside, okay, well, we are not perfect, but thriving for the perfect. Or also looking into the beauty of what had happened with the relationship of your father. What did you really get out of that? So this is the very twofold beauty that I found in this concept of covering the father. And on the other hand, yeah, so striking is to see how much more damage it could be prevented when on one hand the tyrant knows when to go, and the revolutionaries then become the tyrant themselves. Because that's another cycle that has been very common in so many traditions and historical guidelines or storylines. And to have that enacted in this microcosmos of the European Men's Gathering was wonderful to see how many different storylines of whole humanity has been played out there, and everybody has enacted a part of that in there. So to sum up, it has been a major jump into a new phase, also for me personally. I mean, I also have been in one phase of my life before Denmark, and now getting out of 1 year retreat Buddhist center out back into the world, and yeah, going out here again. So it marked as I mean, incidentally, a very transition time for me that came to a very good point. And I'm really willing to make it a group of men's movement here in Vienna, and to see how to really enact those things that I've learned together with other people that want to share collaboratively this space of exploration and really getting the best out of there, and really holding the space for everybody else to really make the best out of there. And one thing that has been also like a masculine way to do it is like you go into this competition to measure yourself, not because you want to have the other one down, but because you want to get better. You want to be a better person, you know? And it has been a wonderful experience for me. Really. I love that, and I will be very curious about what's next.
100%. Iron sharpens iron. Men grow from challenge, and masculine grows through competition, but only when it's positive sum. Which means you don't need victors and the vanquished, and we can leave some of these binary polarity traps that are eating culture right now.
Yeah.
Culture is being devoured by weaponized polarity. When I open my social media feed, when I turn on the news, even when I read the market information about finance markets, we're living in a triggered planet. Everybody's choosing sides. And so certainly the masculine feminine dynamic inside of us as men and playing out there, we want to be better men. We want to measure ourselves. We want to reach our potential and become the strongest version that we can manifest. To me, that's a obvious essence to myself and all the good men I know, including you two. So I think this is a good place to pause here at the hour. So grateful for y'all. This isn't y'all's first time on the podcast, because I have published and aired our Trialogue series. So if you haven't heard those, go check those out on the podcast, sexmasculinitygod.com. You can find our book. I actually just got a fresh batch. I got about 13 books I'm going to be signing and giving to some of my core allies here in Austin, Texas. Feels good to be back in the States where I can Amazon Prime our book in one day to my doorstep. And if you haven't read the book, highly recommend it. Cadell and Daniel, I'd love for you to share for the podcast listeners more about what you're working on individually or other collaborations and where they can find you.
For me, you can find everything I'm doing, I think, best at cadellast.com. You can also find my work if you just YouTube my name, Cadell Last. I have a YouTube channel. I'm the author of Global Brain Singularity, which is a book on the technological singularity. And I also focus on philosophy and psychoanalysis on my YouTube channel. That's about it. Always doing new projects, always something new to say.
Yeah, philosophers love to talk and we love to listen.
Wonderful. Oh, as I said, I have been just out of 1 year Buddhist center, and I'm now starting to get back. One thing I'm going to do very soonish is a course fully on the Mayan calendar to really get the people to learn the whole range of the Mayan calendar in 33 sessions. The other thing is really starting a man circle with all these workshop style and also getting into relationship, sex, and all the meditative guided meditation and stuff like that to really find a space of man, and hopefully also get you guys one day as to Vienna to start a bigger session. I think that is just something that we have on the agenda, maybe collaborating with Manifesto. And the other part are just unfolding. I have to now more like reconnecting with my network in Vienna, which has been also very much onto spirituality, consciousness research, finishing a book on consciousness research that is going to be published in German, and also enacting a network that has been very much on holistic medicine. So there might be more to come. You find all my information on daniel-dick.com. I also have a YouTube channel, also Daniel Dick, and Instagram, and on the website you find everything else. And getting more into this intersection between spirituality and science, maybe also with other projects in Berlin coming up. Still way to see, a lot of space to go.
Amazing. I love it. Daniel's back in the world. He's left the monastery. Look out, people. And Cadell, are you still in Lyon?
Yeah, for the time being.
Okay, so Europe, any listeners on the show in Europe, look out. We're slated for some kind of event next year for sure. I got my European taste buds wetted, and wow, I want to be there. I want to be back. So that will happen. Grateful for you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being on the show. Those of you listening out there, please check out Cadell and Daniel's work. It'll be all linked up here in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, you want to discuss it, shoot me an email, share it out. Sharing is caring. So grateful for you. And look out for a rebrand Q4 and a new season of the Revolution podcast. I'm KO. Thanks for being here. Love y'all. See you next time.